In the depths of winter, at a secluded woodland, an elderly couple are found in a shallow grave. Both have terrible head injuries. It brings to an end a massive search by police. It's an extremely disturbing and apparently senseless crime. Two defenseless pensioners callously battered to death. Who would commit such a monstrous murder? Catching a killer requires conclusive forensic evidence. From clues at the scene of the crime to minute examination in the forensics lab, from the cold reality of the pathologist's table to DNA sampling, digital analysis, each piece of killer evidence brings the murderer closer to justice. It's the 18th of November 1993. The small community of Hambleton in Leicestershire is in a state of confusion. An elderly couple, Derek and Eileen Severs, have mysteriously disappeared with no warning. Everyone's worried apart from one man. Their only son, 37-year-old Roger, who claims his parents have gone by train to London. None of the neighbours believe him.
The place was wild with rumour and speculation. Even at that early stage, they were pointing the finger at Roger Severs, the son.
The police check the local railway station, but find no evidence the couple have been there. They decide to arrest Roger Severs and search the parents' house. Orlando Elmhurst is the crime scene manager.
Normally we don't get called in for a missing persons until there is an element of doubt and there is a level of concern within the police force. A decision had been made that the house needed to be forensically investigated to establish whether there was anything about it that could give a clue as to what has happened to Derek and Eileen.
While the police search the Hambleton area to arrest Roger, the forensic investigation team travels to the Severs bungalow.
We were briefed to be at the bungalow for a set time. We knew that Roger wasn't there, but we were waiting to be told that he had been arrested, because as soon as he was arrested, that then gave us the power to enter the building. In the meantime, we sort of wandered around the outside of it just to get our bearings. It was quite a large area that was to be covered, because it went down from the bungalow down to the edge of the Rutland Water. Some of it had been dug over, and it was sort of interesting because there was quite a frost on that morning, and we did notice that there was sort of differential frosting. So on some part of it there was a very hard frost shown, and on other bits there was very slight frost. What happens is, depending on how the soil is compacted, will depend on how sort of much water there is and then how much frost will appear. And we were wondering, why should that be? What's happening there? Has something been buried there? Obviously, we were looking at the possibility of this being a crime scene, and therefore this differential might mean something significant.
The disturbed earth is the first piece of evidence of something untoward. Moments later, the forensic team get the all clear that Roger has been arrested.
We were given the authority to enter the premises. My first thought was, well, how do we get in there? Because it all looked reasonably secure, and we obviously didn't want to break in. And also, as part of sort of basic scene of crime training, you're always told that you should try and make your approach to the scene an approach that the potential offender would not have made. And the idea of going through maybe the front door, seemed like the obvious route that an offender, if there were one, would have taken. What I did notice was that there was a small window to the bathroom that was slightly ajar. And this seemed to me really quite ideal, both on a sort of a professional level, and it also meant that we wouldn't be actually damaging anything to actually make our entry.
Usually when we attend crime scenes, if there has been access to it, that has the potential to contaminate, to add material, to take material away. And because that hadn't happened in this case, because there was an open window and they could enter the scene in a non-standard way, then of course that helped because it preserved the evidence within it.
I was the slimmest member of the team, and it basically meant that I was the one that was going to go through that window. And being the crime scene manager, obviously I'm the best person to have gone in, assessed the scene, and then effectively opened the door. I climbed in, and to my horror, as I got into it, I suddenly discovered that there was no carpet there. This looked like it could be quite significant.
When the detectives see an absent carpet, rightly they're concerned it's a red flag. Has someone disposed of this carpet to get rid of any incriminating evidence, or is there perhaps a more innocent explanation? Either way, it certainly raises red flags for any crime scene manager. As the crime scene manager, Orlando Elmhurst, enters the bathroom, more suspicious evidence emerges.
I had a quick look round, and I could see that there were some sort of small little pinpricks of blood on various items, which obviously you might expect, one or two little spots of blood, maybe someone cutting themselves shaving. But to see a number of pinpricks about the bathroom at a low level started making alarm bells ring that things were not perhaps as they should be. I'm not saying I panicked, I just suddenly thought I've made a bit of a boo-boo here perhaps, and therefore it was a matter of trying to get out of there as soon as possible, but doing it in a forensically clean way.
The forensics team returns to the bathroom to begin a fuller investigation.
Obviously, one of the first things that you have to do when you get into a crime scene is to get it photographed and recorded. The logic is basically you have to record it, normally by photography. You may take notes and drawings, and then you then start getting on your hands and knees and doing a sort of a really detailed look at what you've got. Within the bathroom, it became quite obvious once we got on our hands and knees and were having a good look around that there were quite a lot of these pinpricks of blood and little bits of blood staining. So we knew that there was something here that needed a forensic expert to come in who could actually interpret blood pattern analysis.
This spray of fine blood droplets is the second piece of evidence. A blood pattern analyst will be able to interpret them and get a clearer idea of what took place in the bathroom.
So one of the first things I did was to contact the forensic laboratory and request that we had a crime scene blood expert come out. And they arranged for that person to come out the next day, which was good.
Then investigators examined the hallway outside.
Almost immediately as we worked our way out of the bathroom, we noticed there were quite a lot of rolled up fibres, yellow fibres, that were sort of situated along the length of the hallway carpet. Probably something like a yellow blanket. You could sort of see that they were sort of rolled fibres together in little piles. And what would cause that? So our thought process was that perhaps something heavy had been put on them and dragged. And again, the hypothesis that we were sort of formulating was, well, perhaps a body might have been put on it from the bathroom, and that would be an easy way to drag a body through the house on this blanket of some form. We then did a quick search of the premises to find out whether we could find those yellow blankets or anything of that colour, and we couldn't.
The curious yellow balls of fibres provide the third piece of evidence. And as the forensic team continues into the kitchen, they notice another carpet has been removed.
Again, you start wondering, why is that not there? There was no evidence of blood in the kitchen, but no carpet in the kitchen did seem it seemed like he was doing an awful lot of clearing up while his parents weren't around. Obviously, as we were making these discoveries, we were having to feed that to the investigation team because they were in a live situation interviewing Roger, and they would put that to Roger. But invariably what we were finding is that the explanation he was giving didn't necessarily fit the facts that we had in front of us. This obviously made Roger become slightly more complicit in what was happening, because he was telling us things that we could probably demonstrate weren't true.
The forensics team has only spent a few hours in the home of Derek and Eileen Severs, and already this missing persons inquiry has all the hallmarks of a murder investigation. Police have discovered a suspicious, recently dug patch of earth in the garden. Fine blood spray in their bathroom, and mysterious balls of yellow fibre in the hallway. This combined evidence strongly suggests there has been foul play. And the couple's only son, Roger, is the chief suspect. He has clearly been active in the house since his parents' disappearance, and his story that they have gone on holiday simply doesn't stack up.
Roger had a very difficult relationship with both his parents. They had very, very high hopes for him, having sent him to private school, but he wasn't going to deliver. It quickly became apparent he wasn't. He couldn't keep a job. He was always unemployed, and they quickly realized he was a pathological liar. He would just lie about everything, and that came clear after the police started interviewing him.
When we look at Roger Severs, he's going around spreading these lies that are quite inconsistent by people who are concerned about the welfare and the whereabouts of his parents. To me, this shows that his actions are very sloppy and disorganised. I think he feels that he's actually a bit more intelligent than he actually is. I think he believes he's going to get away with it. He's overconfident in his abilities, but everything's a bit chaotic to me.
Being caught out in a lie in court, in the dock, or in a police interview, isn't evidence of guilt. People lie for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of motivations. But when somebody is completely lying repeatedly on the same ground and offering new scenarios and making up new lies and being caught out, then of course they're digging themselves deeper and deeper holes.
One of these deep holes Roger is struggling to explain away is evidence of blood specks in the bathroom. Crime scene manager Orlando Elmhurst summons a blood pattern forensic expert to interpret these.
A forensic expert is someone who can give evidence in court, and the court will accept their evidence, so they can offer opinion. Our role as crime scene officers is that we collect evidence, physical evidence, but we're not allowed to offer opinion. We needed a forensic expert to come in and look at this blood distribution and analyse it and say whether or not they thought it was significant.
So the value that bloodstain patterns can bring to an investigation is that it can provide a very clear narrative on actions that have taken place at a crime scene. It can put individuals moving around in that space. It can almost simulate potential things that happen to create the final end product. And so who wouldn't want to do that in the investigation of crime? Who wouldn't want to go back to 15 minutes before the death to try and illustrate potential ways in which individuals have acted in that space, how they've moved, what actions they've delivered if they've been involved in a violent attack?
The forensic scientist came in and had a look, and there were two things about the bathroom that got his interest immediately. One was these small little pinpricks of blood. Now, the reason why pinpricks of blood are important is because if you get cut, you tend to drop blood. However, if you have a pool of blood and that gets hit with a force repeatedly, you get a fine spray being formed, a fine mist. The other thing that he noticed was that underneath the bath, in the bathroom, it got a ledge. And then when that was taken off, there were little droplets of blood under there. So again, this looked as if someone had actually been cleaning up, perhaps, and hadn't noticed A, the very small droplets, because they are very small, and B, they hadn't cleaned on the undersurfaces of some of the items. And this was telling him almost straight away that there had been a repeated impact on some blood.
repeated blows into that injury site will then start to become associated with more tissue damage and increase the amount of spatter. And as that blood starts to increase, the weapon starts to become wet with blood, and as it's been swung, it creates what we call cast-off blood stains. These are blood stains that swing from that weapon as it's been used to deliver multiple blows.
When you do get blood splattering, it's invariably going to be a blunt object. The forensic scientist came up with the words are never really clearly, and that was that a significant event had happened in that bathroom. And really that is the phrase that sticks in my mind, because that really pushed the alarm bell. We've now got something that had the potential for it to be a murder scene. So suddenly that changed the whole emphasis suddenly, and the whole ethos of how the police were going to be investigating this particular crime.
Investigators may have strong evidence of a possible murder site, but they have no way of determining the perpetrator.
In most investigations, you start with a body. In this case, you actually just started with a crime scene and a suspect. Investigations like this, cases like this, are among the most complex and most difficult, because although you might have a fair idea of who did it, even how they did it, might even have some circumstantially or some forensic evidence to say that a crime was committed, you don't necessarily know for certain that somebody has been killed, someone has been murdered, until you actually get the bodies.
Technically, you could argue it could be any murderer. But when we were passing information to the interviewing officers and they were coming back with Roger's excuses as to why these things had happened, that didn't really fit in with the facts that we were seeing. So that made the suspicion lie more and more heavily on Roger.
Despite lavishing Roger with private education and every opportunity in life, it emerges that Derek and Eileen have a troubled relationship with their only child, known locally as Roger the Dodger.
Roger and his parents were always arguing, and the main reason for the argument was always money. Roger had many start-up businesses, all of which had failed. He had spent money he didn't have, borrowed it off his parents, lost it, started another business venture. He always had a new plan. He was a fantasist, a Walter Mitty figure who could just make up stuff and think, I'm going to be successful. But he is their child, so they would always take him in whenever everything failed. They'd rented a house for him, but he couldn't afford to keep paying for it. Comes back home, something goes wrong, he comes back home. He's always coming back home, which is what happened when they went missing.
One thing that really strikes me about Roger Severs is that he was never given the opportunity to learn about failure. He struggled with his exams at school. His father kept financing all his business ideas, even though they didn't really work out. He had a string of failed relationships with various women, and he always came back to stay with his parents. And I think that really speaks to the relationship he must have had with his parents and how he viewed them. He didn't really show any concern about their well-being. He wasn't there to support them or show them any kind of affection.
While Roger does his best to thwart police inquiries, at the Severs bungalow, the crime scene manager and his team have completed a first forensic sweep of the property and move into a detailed search. In the kitchen, they find an interesting note.
What was found in the kitchen was a little sort of list of things that needed to be done. Cleaning the car, cleaning other parts of the house, and the last phrase on that note was dump. And obviously, again, this plays into the fact that we've got to find two missing people. Where are they?
The suspicious to-do list becomes the fourth piece of evidence. But for now, it must be taken at face value.
When officers found this checklist, this to-do list, how to murder and then dump your parents' bodies, this is hallelujah. We have hit nirvana. This is fantastic. But the crime scene investigator, along with the senior police officers, understand that there may be an innocent explanation for this. However unlikely, they will understand that a defendant and a smart defendant's barrister may construct an innocent explanation for every one of the chores placed upon this, including the word dump. But in this instance, it was very compelling evidence.
The investigators still face numerous challenges. There's no material proof the Severs couple have been murdered. Roger's being evasive, and so far, forensics have only found possible evidence of one murder.
We'd sort of found one obvious scene where something could have happened, which was the bathroom. But we knew there were two people potentially involved. The local policeman who covered that area, just chatting to him, and he said, "Oh, well, you parked your car where Derek used to park his car." And that was directly outside the detached garage. And my thought was, well, if he has been attacked, the logic is that probably would have been the taxi came out of the car, and this is where the car was parked. And again, it's sort of classic crime scene training. Always look up, because if someone has been swinging a bloody implement, you get blood drips on the ceiling. So invariably people clean around them, and very rarely clean above them. So standing by the garage, looked up, and there on the underside of the roof was this fine spray. And suddenly we realised we'd actually now got the second site where an offence could have taken place. Presumably he'd attacked him outside. We'd got him the fine spray out there, which again intimates repeated hitting.
This fifth piece of evidence provides police with a credible explanation for the potential fate of both Derek and Eileen.
It all started to fit together, that perhaps the mother was killed in the bathroom, and perhaps the father had been killed as he arrived back in his car.
For a lot of perpetrators like Roger, he would have thought he's reasonably forensic aware. Most of us are forensically aware. We've seen enough of CSI and various crime television programs. So in his instance, he was able to get rid of the carpets and do a certain amount of counter-forensic activity. But if it's a violent attack, if it's a violent murder, it's nearly impossible to kind of clean up all evidence of a crime.
We can make attempts to clean up visible traces that, with cleaning materials, but those will always leave an indelible trace. Actually, what's happening is the grout is collecting all of that material. It's been pushed through the carpet onto the floorboards. To the eye, it looks like I've done a good job there. And then a forensic scientist comes along and thinks, wow, look at all that blood in the grout.
Inside the Severs garage, there is more evidence of cleaning. This time, the perpetrator has done a thorough job.
When we went into the garage, there was a sort of quite large stain on the floor that smelled strongly of Jay's fluid or cleaning fluid. And we weren't quite sure what the relevance of this was. Again, we recorded it and photographed it. We tried testing it for blood, but it didn't come up as a positive test. And then suddenly that all then started making sense as to what was that stain inside the garage. And presumably the body dragged in and then left to bleed in the garage. And that had been subsequently cleaned up inside, which is why we couldn't get any positive tests.
But the damning new evidence on the outside of the garage door suggests that Derek and Eileen were murdered at their home. Police have already discovered evidence in their garden, bathroom, hallway, and kitchen that indicates some kind of violent act has taken place. The majority of murders are committed by family members or close associates of the victims. And in this case, all the evidence gathered so far points towards Derek and Eileen's son, Roger. He has been arrested and is being questioned by detectives. But without his parents' bodies, the police still lack the crucial proof they need that the couple are actually dead and that it was Roger who killed them.
Roger's being extremely uncooperative. They know he's done it. Everything points to the fact that he's done it. But they want the bodies, they need the bodies, because there could be all sorts of legal arguments put forward in court which may get him off.
There are no bodies, but police have found evidence that 2 attacks have likely taken place in the house, and now must decide whether to escalate the investigation.
In this case, there were sufficient red flags, sufficient concerns, high-risk concerns about a vulnerable elderly couple, then a senior investigating officer can say, this is a high risk, this is a very serious case, I'm very concerned. Then once we can escalate this into a high-risk inquiry, a high-risk missing persons case, potentially murder, then they can bring a whole bunch of extra resources to it, which will then accelerate this investigation.
And of course, the clock was ticking from the police point of view, because you can't hold up someone indefinitely. We needed to actually still find Derek and Eileen, because we didn't know for positive that there had been a murder. So there were a lot of strands to the inquiry. So one of the possibilities that came to light fairly early on was, well, why are the carpets missing? You know, could they have been wrapped up in the carpets, bundled up, and then taken down to the local tip? The police were having to go down to the tip and investigate. And one of the possibilities was, of course, you've got this differential mud frosting. Could someone have been buried there? So, again, things like a team of geophysicists were called in, and they can look under the ground, as it were, using electrical currents. And they could sort of cover the whole area to see whether or not there had been anything buried under it. That turned out negative. But again, you know, this was all going on, and over the following days, different lines of inquiries were taking place.
After a thorough search of the house and attached garage, the team moves on to the property's outbuildings.
There were a number of sort of sheds and another garage. Inside there was parked a blue car, and from the number plate found out that it actually belonged to Derek. And what was strange about it was that when I looked into the windscreen, there were all these cleaning tokens. So that was obviously, he obviously liked to keep it really nice and polished and clean. And yet, when we looked at the wheel arches, they were caked in mud. And again, that seemed really inconsistent. Looking inside it, there was a little bit of what was testing positive for blood on the inside sill of the boot. It all sort of pointed towards the potential of that. Perhaps that was the vehicle that was used to deposit the bodies.
The blood in Derek's car becomes the sixth piece of evidence that would later be confirmed as belonging to the couple. Police now believe that the car has been used to transport the bodies. Can the mud prove crucial in finding Derek and Eileen?
In a modern car, there's digital information about where that car's been, but in an older car, as with any kind of vehicular transport, you could look at what sort of materials there are on the outside of the car, which might indicate where it's been. And there are very clear differences between a car that's only ever been driven in an urban environment and one that's been driven into woodland, for example. And then those specific areas of woodland will have a bit of a signature. So there may be some inference that can be drawn about where has this car been by collecting some of that soil and plant material.
Crime scene manager Orlando Elmhurst sets about trying to match the mud to local soils in the hope that he may be able to identify the spot police need to search.
First point of call was I phoned up the forensic laboratory at Huntingdon and sort of said, what can be done with mud? And they responded, not much. We can just look at a region and that's it. Now, I used to be an archaeologist prior to going into forensic science, and I knew that soil was much more than just that. I spent 6 months as a student just fishing up beetle remains from mud. So I thought, right, I need to find an alternative route than going down the standard Home Office route. I also knew that Leicester had really quite a good archaeology department. So I phoned up the archaeology department and said, look, I've got some soil here. It might be of interest to us because we are struggling with some aspect of what we believe might be a murder inquiry. Is there anyone there who could do some soil analysis for us? The archaeology department said, no, but we do know someone in the geology department. We've got a Tony Brown who can probably help you. And that's exactly what we wanted to hear. There was someone there who was willing to try this novel approach and see what could be gleaned from it.
Professor Tony Brown is tasked with examining mud on Derek's car at Rutland Forensic Garage. Investigators hope his expertise in using pollen analysis and archaeology will also prove invaluable in tracking down the missing couple.
I was called down to the laboratories, and as soon as I saw the car, I realised that it had probably been off-road quite recently, because it not only had the brown mud, it also had green stems of plants, including grasses, and it must have picked them up fairly recently for those still to contain chlorophyll and still be green.
To confirm his theory, Professor Brown initially analyzes the mud using X-ray diffraction, which identifies mineral content.
We were able to look at the microscopic mineral content, the mineralogy of the sample. And that is useful because it confirms the geology from which the soil was created. It had little bits of roadstone, that is not unusual. It also had some small fossils. These are fossils from the Lincolnshire limestone. They're called ooids. That reduced the search area for the Severs bodies in half, because it meant they only needed to look at areas which were underlain by Lincolnshire limestone.
To try and narrow the search area further, Professor Brown studies the pollen composition within the samples.
The pollen in a sample reflects where that sample came from, because if it's come from the floor of a woodland, then it reflects the trees that were growing directly above it. The vast majority of pollen doesn't travel very far, so pollen can give you a very good picture of the local vegetation, particularly of woodland. The pollen that I recovered from the sample was basically woodland. It was dominated by oak and hazel and a few other trees, but it also had some herbs in it and some grass, so it was therefore not completely woodland. So it was either a small woodland, deciduous, mixed deciduous woodland, or it was at the edge of a woodland.
This type of vegetation is common in England and doesn't significantly narrow the search area. But as Professor Brown continues his analysis, he strikes botanical gold.
The pollen I found in the samples also had one rather unusual pollen grain. The unusual pollen grain was horse chestnut. Now, horse chestnut is not a native tree to the British Isles, so it's only found in some woodlands, and I had to immediately double check that it was horse chestnut with our reference collection, but there was no doubt that it was horse chestnut, and it was in all 4 of the wheel arches.
Professor Brown's analysis reduces a vast 40 square kilometre search area down to a handful of woodland sites. But it's something unrelated to plants that closes the net further.
There was one other find that was rather important, and that was monofilament nylon, fishing line. We had fishing line in the wheel arches.
This 8th piece of evidence completes Professor Brown's environmental profile.
So that tells you that it's likely to be derived from a small woodland that has mixed deciduous trees, that has horse chestnut, that is near water, hence the fishing nylon, and also is on the Lincolnshire limestone. And there really aren't many locations in the region that would fit that profile.
Professor Brown, with help from the Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust, is able to identify 5 woodlands that fit his profile. Of these, Armley Woods is the closest, just over a mile away from the Severs home.
As soon as I gave this initial profile to the police of the likely location, then they immediately put the search into those woodlands. And then it was a matter of 24 hours before they found the bodies.
As they started to walk around, one of the policemen saw that the earth was moving underneath his feet. So he decided to stop, put his hand into the soil, and it rested on human flesh.
Professor Brown's forensic pollen analysis and the piece of fishing line have led officers to a shallow grave. If it does contain the bodies of Derek and Eileen Severs, then this could be the killer evidence police need to charge their son Roger with murdering his parents. The Severs have now been missing for more than a fortnight, and investigators have already amassed evidence that strongly suggests they may have been killed. The dug earth in their garden, blood spatters in the bathroom, strange fibres on a carpet, a sinister to-do list, and blood on the garage door. In order to prove the couple's son Roger is responsible, police will need to identify the bodies as Eileen and Derek and prove it was him that buried them. They will also need to demonstrate that material gathered from their bodies is consistent with the forensic evidence they've gathered so far.
I was sitting in the office and I got the phone call sort of saying, you need to come down to Hambleton now with your team. We think we found the bodies. At that point, all that they had found was a small area of skin. So they didn't know what they'd actually found. They didn't know at that point that it actually was Derek and Eileen. They just knew that they'd found something that was interesting. We must have got there, this was about 4 o'clock, I think, and it was beginning to get dark. We decided that it needed to be excavated. So having got a sort of round shape, which was basically the mound, we then stuck some strings over it and quartered it. We then took out 1/4 layer at a time. So first layer off with the dead leaves, then put into a bag. The next layer would be some mud, and that was put into a bag. So we kept every layer as we took it off, but we took it off layer by layer by layer. And at one point we actually came across a layer of tiles, which presumably was there to stop anyone accidentally digging through. But then, having got down to the bottom bit, we then found in that first quadrant some of this yellowy green blanket wrapped around a pair of legs. It was then decided that we needed to actually firmly establish that we'd got 2 bodies there. You can't call off the search when you've only found 1. So the instruction was then to take out the second half, which we did in exactly the same way. And then we found a second pair of legs. And again, it was pretty obvious that these were now 2 bodies that we'd got.
The 2 bodies are wrapped in a yellow blanket that match the balls of fibres found in the Severs hallway. But investigators must identify if it is really Derek and Eileen and also establish a cause of death.
There was then the final push to fully excavate the bodies because really a post-mortem had to be carried out as soon as possible. We did have the pathologist there with us as we were doing this, and it was fairly obvious once we'd uncovered both the bodies that they had received some traumatic head injuries, which was then verified at the post-mortem. They'd obviously been hit with a blunt force numerous times. So because the trauma had been to the back of their head, the faces were intact, and therefore it was reasonably straightforward to carry out a visual identification of the 2 people, and it was Derek and Eileen.
The post-mortem had delivered exactly what the detectives had hoped for. The finding of blunt force trauma to the heads matched the fine spray of blood spatter found in the Severs bathroom and garage. At this stage, the jigsaw was beginning to fit together and Roger's story was falling apart.
Derek and Eileen's bodies provide the killer evidence in this case. All investigators must do now is prove Roger buried them. Crime scene manager Orlando Elmhurst suspects this proof lies in the burial soil itself.
It was obviously that these 2 bodies had been dumped in what was effectively a sort of a shallow dip trough, and soil had then been put on top of it. Different types of soil. It was quite strange, really, because you'd imagine that all the soil on top of the bodies would be homogeneous, all exactly the same, but they weren't. They were definite sort of horizons, definite sort of layers. And so in one of the layers of soil, we found a potato. And a potato is not a natural woodland vegetable. So that must have come from somewhere else.
This final piece of evidence is sent to a potato expert. He identifies it as an extremely rare variety. When investigators search the Severs garden, it exactly matches those grown by Derek.
What Roger was doing was taking soil from the garden and then down to where he'd disposed the bodies, and he was covering them in soil that came from the garden. And therefore that provided another match back to the bungalow.
This final discovery ties up the investigation. Roger, the only person with access to Derek's car, used earth from the freshly dug vegetable patch at the family home to bury his parents. And the mud caking Derek's car is from repeated trips to the burial site.
Well, in the absence of any bodies, obviously the investigators faced a major uphill task. But consideration of pollen analysis was a huge breakthrough and remarkable and very unusual. I think it's a real true credit to the crime scene manager that effectively constructed a case that was so strong that Roger was effectively doomed.
On the 1st of December 1994, at Nottingham Crown Court, Roger pleads guilty to killing his parents by reason of diminished responsibility. During the trial, the grim motive for their murder finally emerges.
Roger had wanted to buy into a pub, but he needed £10,000. His dad refused because he knew that Roger was never going to make a success of this, and Roger was furious with that. Eileen had come back home and he went to her and said, I want some money. I really need the money, otherwise I cannot start this pub up. And she said, no, you're not going to get it. And that was the point that the murder happened. She went into the bathroom, Roger followed her in, he'd got a steak mallet in his hand, and he started to beat her about the head. Now, he hit her 8 times. Just after he'd murdered his mother, Roger could hear the gravel noise outside as Derek came back in his car. As soon as he got out, Roger started to attack him. He hit him 10 times with the same steak mallet, and that was why blood was later found on the garage door, because he just parked his car right in front of it.
On the 6th of December 1994, a year after his parents' death, Roger is found guilty of their murder. He is given 2 life sentences.
The judge, Mr. Justice Laws, was very firm in his declaration to him. He said, the jury have convicted you of murder, and there is only one sentence I can impose, and that is life imprisonment. And after that, the judge was very emphatic in his praise of the officers. He said this was an admirable investigation, enabling the trial to proceed smoothly and relatively quickly.
Roger Severs brutally murders both of his parents with a steak mallet. To me, that really tells us something about his frame of mind at the time. To have killed one person with such a brutal, prolonged method is pretty horrific, but he did it twice. So there would have been lots of opportunities for him to have regretted his actions and stopped them at the moment, but he didn't do that. It shows a humongous lack of empathy. I don't think he even sees his parents as actual humans. He just sees them as an opportunity to manipulate. He sees them as a resource to take as much as he possibly can. And then when they've served their purpose, he's just able to discard them without even the slightest ounce of regret.
Murder's always difficult, isn't it? You're dealing with the sort of the most heinous crimes that are out there. So that's never a good thing. But when you actually find that a son, a child, has murdered not one but both parents, it's depressing to think what that environment, that family environment, must have been like. And it's obviously something that's been thought out, and he's planned, and he's waited, and he's done it, and you know, the whole thing is just it's impossible to get your mind around.
According to a study, most cases of parricide, the murder of one's parents, are linked to child abuse, serious mental health issues, or dangerous antisocial behaviour. Yet Roger Severs was given almost everything he asked for in life by his parents. But when that financial tap was turned off, it seems that greed drove him to kill his mother and father.